Uber is set to go public in the biggest IPO of a U.S. company since Facebook 7 years ago. It'll probably be valued at around $90 billion. So why does it matter? Well, Facebook changed the way we socialize and the way we advertise. Google changed the way we search and watch video. Uber, as much as any company in a generation, has changed the way we work and the way we get from A to B. Not only that, it's a company that seemed to nearly implode from public scrutiny just a couple years ago. As a public company, it's about to get a lot more attention. Can investors handle that? Can society handle that? Welcome to Fortt Knox, Rich Ideas and Powerful People. I am John Fortt from CNBC here at the NASDAQ market site overlooking Times Square. With me today to talk Uber, Ina Fried from Axios. If you're thinking about investing in this IPO, you probably know somebody who is, even if you're not. So we're going to break it all down on this company that's the king of the ride-hailing game and also losing like billions of dollars a year. Ina, good to see you.
Yeah, good to see you, John.
So ahead of Uber's debut on Friday, the question is this maybe the next Facebook or Amazon? Because Amazon's a comparison that's often getting made. It's a company that seemed to not make a lot of money at first. There were all kinds of questions about the investments they were making and the model, but they are sitting pretty now. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, that's really the question. Is this Amazon at the beginning, when they were still a bookstore, before their economics really kicked in, and they have this profit engine that's just nascent and needs investment? Or is it Pets.com, where you just have an unsustainable business model? I think the truth is probably somewhere in between. I don't think you have the next Amazon. I think you probably have a business that, if they can stay dominant in ride-hailing, and ride-hailing moves to autonomous cars, then maybe the economics start to work. A lot of people that have looked at Uber's business say it just doesn't, the unit economics don't get there with human drivers.
But there's like everything, almost everything is in between, Amazon and Pets.com. That's like...
Okay, fair enough. Fair enough.
I don't know. I'm thinking, having talked to Uber a bit and looked at its... I like it better than Lyft. I'll say that much because its economics are better than Lyft's. But I think at the same time, you got to look at these worker agitations. I hesitate to call it a strike because I called up the Uber app today when these workers are supposed to be striking. And right now, let's see, in Midtown Manhattan, New York is a major city where this is supposed to be happening. I see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 Uber cars available within 3 blocks.
Yeah, I think it's going to be very tough. I mean, part of the reason Uber works as well as it does is when there aren't people on the system, there's inducements to get people into the system. And so a strike is actually a perfect sort of system for Uber's economics to work. They pay, surge pricing, drivers make more drivers come on. I think, again, if you're investing in Uber, though, you're really not betting on the current moment because they are going to lose money. They're going to probably have dominant scale over Lyft, especially globally. Lyft in the U.S., is more of a competitor. But really, the economics are, they're competing over who can get that money-losing ride.
Yeah.
So that's not obviously why you invest. You don't
think
want
it's Amazon.
90% of a money-losing market.
I'm going to come right out and say it. I don't think it's Amazon. Here's part of the reason I don't think it's Amazon. I think if we have an economic slowdown and downturn, and given how fast we've been going for the amount of time we've been going that fast, it's practically inevitable. Just like Amazon had a downturn in its stock, Uber's going to have something. And it's got so many moving parts, from Uber Eats and the drivers involved there and the restaurants involved on the platform to regular old Uber itself, to the trucking business that they're trying to grow, that are potentially exposed to that. It feels to me like the investor reaction could be worse. And Amazon's reaction to the dot-com bust wasn't so great itself. And so investors, if you're going to jump into this anywhere near the IPO, you better invest in some XLAX at the same time. Now, of course, the other side of the coin for Uber is a potential bust. So what are the chances, as I've been kind of laying out here, that this IPO flops, that maybe they're pitching it the wrong way? I'm reminded of GoPro, which was pitching itself as some kind of a media company before it went public, and it's obviously not that. Ina, do you think this stock has that problem?
No, I mean, I think Uber is pretty well understood. I think where it gets really tricky is, I think if you're investing for anywhere near the long term, you're betting on two things. One, that Uber is going to make this transition to autonomous cars where the economics get better. But more importantly, that its scale, that its approach will actually have a good share of that business. And here's where it gets tough. In today's world, Uber has scale, they have drivers, people come on, and really that's their advantage is they have a solid network, customers and drivers. It's a marketplace. When we get to autonomous cars, it's not a marketplace. So it's really about technology at that point. And then people that develop their own autonomous vehicles, companies like Waymo, may be at a better place. Uber has tried but struggled to develop their own autonomous cars. They appear to be considerably behind Waymo and perhaps some of the others. The car makers are going to want in. Once it's an autonomous vehicle, it's not a two-sided marketplace. It's a technology play, and I think they'll face a lot more competition.
Well, isn't there going to be a market maybe based on slightly different things like, I don't know, how quickly the car gets to you, how well they've planned the route, how nice the car is and well kept up the car is, whether they have snacks in the car. I mean, there are all kinds of things I imagine that how nice the robot voice is of the robot driver, you know, the software driver who's not actually physically in the car. It seems to me that there are all kinds of ways that these companies could compete. Who knows if they will?
Sure, and I think we get there eventually, but you're talking about the amenities. I think the core is going to be who has the best vehicle technology, and the economics around that vehicle are going to be far more important. Once you have good economics, you can throw snacks or anything else in there. You're talking literally peanuts at that point.
Yeah, literally. And I agree with you on this much. There's nothing I see in the way Uber's describing itself that's just fiction or close to it. Businesses that they're touting that they haven't actually spun up. I guess the closest thing to it, perhaps, is this whole idea of autonomy, but I don't know if you really have to be counting on that in a certain period of time in order to feel like this is a worthwhile investment or valuation for that matter at all. And finally, not
I mean, they have
everybody's...
flying cars, too. Flying cars might be a little bit of a futuristic bet.
Yes, flying car, boy. That whole idea, it sounded cool as a kid, but now danger from three-dimensional space kind of worries me. Maybe getting reacquainted with New York traffic, New York airspace, I find even more worrying. The wild card in all of this, you know, finally on this part, once again, the drivers. Now, it seems like on the one hand, you've got people talking about flexibility. Isn't it wonderful? I've already got a car and I can make some extra money on the side. On the other hand, we see some of the drivers out protesting today. Doesn't seem to be having much of an effect on wait times on the app, but they're saying, boy, I can hardly afford the car. I've got to work X number of hours just to break even. It's hard to know what the truth is here, but it sure seems clear that Uber has a heck of a lot of leverage over labor in this equation, right?
I think they do. I mean, I think the flexibility is a selling point. It's why they have a pretty steady labor pool. I mean, for a lot of people that either need extra income or between jobs, you know, it's one of the best options out there. But at the same time, the economics for the drivers are really tough. You know, most people aren't factoring in what they're going to owe in taxes, what they're actually paying to maintain and upkeep their car.
Yeah.
And some of the studies, when you factor all that in, it's not that lucrative, but, you know, it does put cash in your pocket.
And it's baffling to me in one sense because the labor market is so tight now. I mean, the unemployment rate is at like 50-year lows. But at the same time, this isn't a market that's efficiently working. The reason why these drivers aren't making more money is because investors have put enough money into Uber and Lyft that they can afford to not charge an actual profitable rate, right? So what happens when both of these companies are public and investors want them to make money and maybe there's more pressure for them to have a model that actually works day to day? Does the price go up? Do drivers actually get happier?
I don't think drivers get happier because I think if the price goes up, that's going to go toward making Uber less money losing, not more money for drivers. So I think
they still get their cut?
Prices inevitably will rise. They'll get their cut, but you know, don't forget a lot of the economics right now are to get people using the system. So the drivers are getting paid more than Uber could naturally afford to pay them if it were also trying to make money. So if Uber has pressure to make more money, I don't think you're going to see drivers getting paid more. I think you'll see their cut go up. I think you will see rates rise. to some degree, especially as Uber squeezes out public transit in some cities, as people give up their car and bet on being able to use ride sharing. I think you will see some elasticity, but not a ton. At a certain point, somebody says, is it worth it for me to walk? Is it worth it? So it's a very interesting and delicate balance that I think we'll only know exactly where that lies when we see some experiments.
And
that's
it's
one thing
crazy
Uber has been
complicated,
really good at.
Right? Because if we get an economic downturn, the supply of drivers probably going to go up. I mean, maybe not the supply of quality drivers, but there'll be more people wanting to drive. So is that going to put any kind of downward pressure on wages, or, you know, will it find some natural equilibrium point? I don't know. Well, it's time for digits. Spotlighting a few numbers out of Uber's IPO that caught my eye this week. Siri has got the first. Siri.
90 days.
90 days. Now, if Uber CEO Dara Khosrowshahi can keep the company's valuation above $120 billion for 90 days, he's going to receive quite the payday, $100 million. You know, I've seen all kinds of executive pay packages rolled out, and they talk about how, you know, they're doing it for the health and to have the interests aligned with shareholders. I mean, I get the whole valuation thing. People thought Uber's valuation was going to be up in the 120, but this seems horrible. You know, keep its valuation up around 120 billion for 90 days. I mean, there are all kinds of ways you could do that that aren't necessarily great for the health of the company long term, it seems to me.
Well, and also, you know, it's one thing to reward an executive's stock performance over time because you're talking about creating long-term value. But here we're really talking about a short-term thing, which really isn't in the executive's control, certainly not using any natural tools at their disposal. So, I mean, that sort of thing concerns me. I mean, why would you make that what you compensate your executive? I mean, doing all kinds of things that Dara's done, whether he's done a good job or not, like, you know, changing the image, you know, driver satisfaction, those things, he's done a lot of things, but keeping the stock price at an arbitrary level for 90 days, that doesn't seem like the sort of thing you want to tie compensation to. You know, it's certainly not something I've heard of being used before.
I mean, and can you imagine $100 million for 90 days over a $120 billion valuation? Like, what kind of fortitude do you have to have, like, as a person, if the stock is sitting at $119 billion valuation and you've got maybe the inkling of some good news and you don't know how it's going to pan out for the next half of the year, to not say anything on the call, or to be conservative in a way that's perhaps judicious if you've got $100 million hanging in the balance?
I mean, it's a strange set of incentives. Again, it's not what you usually see boards and companies choose to incentivize their executives for the reasons you've outlined. And also, as an executive, it's not really, I don't really want to be evaluated on something that I have that little natural control over. Again, as you say, I could do a bunch of artificial things that might temporarily do it, but in general, I want to be compensated on the things that I have control. Am I making progress to making Uber a long-term healthy business? Am I helping shareholders over time? Yes. But over a 90-day period, that's not really, again, in my natural control, unless I do something artificial.
$100 million. Wow. All right. Siri, hit us with that second digit.
10,000.
10,000. That's technically 5 digits. It's also 10,000 trips. That's how many rides Uber serves out per minute. More than 10,000 rides a minute. We did the math. You know, that is an extraordinary number of rides, especially given all the stuff we've been talking about how the model isn't exactly profitably working right now. So if Uber, as it now exists, pricing all of that goes away, people 10,000 times a minute are going to have to make a different kind of decision about how they're getting from A to B, or at least a different kind of calculation about how much that's going to cost, right?
Well, I mean, it really has reshaped the way we think about transportation, especially in large cities, obviously. some of the hubs like New York and San Francisco, but also, car-centric places like LA that didn't have cabs. You really couldn't rely on anything other than a car. I think it really has transformed how we look at transportation. It's made car ownership a different equation. So people that had 2 cars going down to 1, people that were on the fence about owning a car. So I think, certainly Uber and its competitors, but really Uber, for the most part, deserve a lot of credit for adding an additional option into the transportation equation, especially when you look at, overcrowded cities with big urban traffic problems.
But I tell you
Although
what,
there's studies that say Uber makes traffic worse, too.
Both ways, yeah. People were arguing that Uber made traffic worse in New York. Turns out a lot of that was construction. But I tell you the tragedy to me, I grew up in New York for the first roughly 8.5 years of my life. Spent some time riding the subway. I ride it now in between work locations, for example. And the subway, it's an amazing, wonderful thing. Relatively cheap, can get you across enormous distances for pretty cheap. It enables people to live out in Queens, out in the Bronx, commute into work in Manhattan, deals with cost of living issues, et cetera, et cetera. And yet, New York's public transit system, the subway, is crumbling. DC's doing the same. But at the same time, we've got this private model that doesn't exactly work from an economic standpoint, at least not naturally in the way that we've seen. We see it taking over to that extent. And it makes you wonder, why can't society figure out how to put the right kind of investment into public transit without wasting it? Why does it have to be Uber?
Yeah, I mean, I think we're seeing some of the early complications of that. Now, I think a lot of the crumbling infrastructure predates Uber. I think it's a lack of investment by a lot of these cities and regions. But I think
exactly. But if rich people,
you hit a bigger problem.
Yeah.
Yes.
I mean,
that's going to be the huge issue. Is if the wealthy people that have choice and flexibility here choose Uber, the people that rely on public transit still need it, and there's less money going into those systems. That's a potentially huge issue. We're already seeing it. Certainly in San Francisco, I take public transit a lot of the time, but I take it less than I did before Uber. I take Uber and other ride-sharing options some of the time, and that's taking money out of the public transit system.
Because there are people taking a dump in the BART over there. I mean, I lived in San Francisco, too. I know the issue, but that's part of my issue, too, is that super rich people are pouring their money into investments like Uber, where the economics don't exactly work, right? But the tax revenues either aren't coming in or they're being wasted once they do come in to actually fix and maintain the infrastructure that currently exists. I'm off on a little bit of a tangent, though it's all kind of transportation and public related. But anyway, final digit. Siri, give it to us.
75 million.
75 million. That's the total amount of drivers Uber currently, I would almost say employees, but they're not employees. They're kind of associated with this number of riders. There are a whole lot of people in the world. There are a lot more people that they could touch, right?
I mean, there are. I think to your point, the next time we have an economic downturn, that labor supply is actually going to go up. Like, again, I think there will be more gig economy jobs. I think it's one of the ways that our economy is transforming. There's obvious concerns about that. There's no benefits, clearly. Healthcare is not universal, and there's no benefits with being an Uber driver. So that's one issue. Pay is another issue, what you actually are making after you deduct all the expenses that are your own, liability. There's all these issues. But I certainly think these types of gig economy jobs are going to become more plentiful as our work shifts. I mean, work is no doubt shifting as digitization and automation and AI take over a lot of good jobs that are out there.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And now it's time for Hard Knocks. We're going to take a look at some of the hot takes in tech this past week, Uber related. First up, Uber founder Travis Kalanick getting denied the opportunity to ring the opening bell at the New York Stock Exchange Friday when the company presumably goes public. He can be there, but up on the platform where the bell's getting rung, that's going to be Dara, not Travis. And I mean, we know there's quite a bit of historical controversy around Travis Kalanick's role, but it's kind of a hard knock, isn't it, Ina?
It is. I imagine this is a tough call. I mean, Dara has done a tremendous amount of work to rebuild the culture. He'll talk about culture issues, and he's really talking about Travis issues, and he inherited a lot of them. He's done a lot to change the company's reputation and distance himself from Travis. At the same time, you know, Travis did build Uber into what it is. It wouldn't be Uber without Travis. So, you know, I think this could have gone either way. I mean, would be something nice about, you know, noting his contribution. At the same time, Uber and Dara are really trying to say we're a different company than it was under Travis. So, you know, maybe there's some middle ground here. As you say, he can be there. He just can't be on ringing the bell. I don't know if he'll actually show up to have a lesser role. That also doesn't seem super Travis-y.
It would be kind of classy, though. And plus, it's hard to cry too hard for Travis as he sits down there and counts out, what, like $2 billion worth of personal valuation you know, that suddenly become more liquid, or would soon. I don't know. And how about Lyft? Shares down pretty considerably since its IPO. Uber was looking like it might go public at a much higher valuation until Lyft came out. And everybody had been saying, oh, good for Lyft, getting out there first. Well, it turned out to be not so great for either of them.
Yeah, I mean, I think if Lyft had waited, it might have been worse for Lyft in the sense of, I think they got the benefit of this was your first chance to invest in ride sharing as a public investor. So I do think they probably made the right call for them.
Yeah.
You know, I think there were some people that didn't want to wait for Uber that invested. So I think I totally get their rationale. You know, at the same time, all the things that we've said about Uber and the challenges of their economics apply to Lyft. Plus their subscale.
Yeah, worse.
So I mean, it's a much tougher sell. I'm not, you know, being a kinder, gentler Uber. That might play for riders as a marketing campaign. I don't know that plays for investors. So
yeah.
It's certainly a tougher call. You know, they've certainly tried to make the case for that. Again, it's a better marketing campaign than it is an investor strategy.
I don't know if
well,
it works
and
anymore,
that's the thing.
because Uber's now a
Uber's
kinder, gentler Uber, and with these
Uber.
strikes and stuff happening, I mean, I see Lyft thrown in there just the same as Uber. It's not like the riders are striking against Uber and saying, but Lyft is wonderful. As a matter of fact, Lyft is arguably putting so many driver incentives out there that they are depressing the price of a ride-sharing ride, right?
Well, I mean, they're both. I think there's plenty, you know, Uber and Lyft are certainly spending money to take share from one another. And, you know, as they're both going public, they both have incentive to do that. And we're seeing that. Again, I think, you know, it is tough. The economics for Lyft, it's tough to make the case. How is it better to be a smaller Uber from a dollars and cents standpoint? And to your point, I think, you know, Uber has staked out the kinder, gentler Uber under Dara. So even as a marketing campaign, it's tough. And don't forget, in a lot of cities, certainly in San Francisco, drivers are drivers for both.
Yeah.
They have both systems, and so they're very sensitive to who's offering them a better deal that day. And that competition does put pressure on the economics for the companies. And I think that affects Uber and Lyft pretty equally.
Yeah, it's kind of like being like, well, you know, we're like McDonald's, but we don't serve fries and we have no drive-through, and that's our competitive advantage. I don't know. Maybe they can figure it out. Ina, thanks for being with us. Follow Ina on Twitter at Ina Fried. And finally, sticking with the theme of the future of transportation, I had the opportunity to sit down with Mobileye's co-founder and CEO Amnon Shashua. Mobileye, of course, owned by Intel. They do computer vision, particularly when it comes to cars. And we're talking about what's next in autonomous driving, what's going to separate the eventual self-driving winner from the rest. Take a listen.
The technology of building a self-driving system is not something that anyone can do. I believe eventually it will converge to a small number of players, single-digit number of players that, you know, had the capability of building the technology, validating the technology, working with regulatory bodies on finding the right regulation, to put these cars on the road, and there are huge challenges on building a self-driving system with all the liability around it.
How do you handle that, for example? Just the insurance and liability issues.
This is the RSS that we talked about back at the CES, where we build a safety model, a formal safety model, published it. We're working with regulatory bodies around the world in formalizing and standardizing the safety model. So this is one element. The second element, you need to provide agility. These cars need to drive in an agile manner, because otherwise they'll block the city. No city would want, many cars like this blocking traffic.
That I worry about, because if everybody were a good driver, then autonomous vehicles, I can imagine, would work beautifully. But I grew up in New York, where it's sort of like survival of the fittest on the roads. And I hear, some places in Israel, it's similar.
Very similar.
So how do you account for drivers who are going to do crazy, unexpected things, cut people off, disobey traffic rules? Are the autonomous vehicles going to be able to keep up, or will they end up blocking traffic?
This is the challenge, and we have a solution for this challenge. That the way our model works is that we go and formalize what it means to be in a dangerous situation. Once you can formalize this, and you need to talk with regulatory bodies on standardizing the parameters of this model. Once you formalize what it means to be in a dangerous situation, the autonomous car can reach the threshold between non-dangerous and dangerous, never pass that threshold. And allowing you to reach that threshold gives you the ability to be agile, gives you the ability, for example, to change lane while forcing another driver to slow down. This is what we do in congested traffic, right? We don't just turn the signal and wait for other cars to give us space. We force our way, but in a way that is careful, right? You don't just, jump in and the other car needs to apply emergency braking. So the rules behind what it means to do a maneuver which is agile yet careful needs a definition. With humans, we don't have this definition because it depends on societal norms, depends on legal precedences of past accidents. But with machines, we need to formalize it. Otherwise, the first accident that will happen will kill the industry.
Did I mention I grew up in New York? I feel like I maybe said that once or twice this show. He grew up in Israel, by the way. That's the connection there. And Intel has, of course, centered a lot of its work on this stuff in Israel. That's where Mobileye is. Amnon Shashua, by the way, on the podcast this week. He's not only the co-founder and CEO of Mobileye, he happens to be a senior vice president at Intel, which purchased the company. He's also a professor at Hebrew University, specializing in this particular area. He's got a doctorate, did postdoc work. It's crazy. Hear all about it. Meanwhile, that'll do it for Fortt Knox. Again, this weekend on the podcast, you'll get the whole interview with Shashua, available everywhere you get your podcasts. It's been great. Don't miss the next episode, and see you next time.